We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 103b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a brisa that if you have a carbon ola in which the bailim, the owners, do not satisfy their obligation by bringing that carbon ola, so then in such a situation, we say that the Kohanim do not get the ore, they do not get the hide. And the brisa said one might think that's true in a situation of an ola which was brought shalol lishma. In such a situation, even though the carbon is kosher, but it doesn't satisfy the obligation of the owner, as Rashi said in the previous summit. Again, even though it's technically kosher, but still lo yizku ba'ora. Maybe one would think that they shouldn't get the hide. As the Gemara, as the Brisa now continues, Lo Yehu Kohanim Zakoyin Ba'ora. Again, the Kohanim, they shouldn't merit to get the hide by this case of Shalol Lishma. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Or Ha'ola Mikol Makom. It says, Or Ha'ola, that's an inclusion, and that means to say, again, in any situation, meaning to say, even in a situation of Shalol Lishma, there's a particular inclusion for that. And the Brisa continues, the pasuk says, Or Ha'ola, Ein Li'ela Or Ha'ola. It says, Or Ha'ola, I only know the hide of the Ola, goes to the Kohanim, Oros Kachei Kachim Minayin. How do I know the hides of karbonos which are Kachei Kachim, like Chatos and Asham? They also go to the Kohanim. Talmud Lomar Or Ha'ola, the pasuk says Or Ha'ola Asher Hikriv. Since it says Asher Hikriv, as Rashi says Asher Hikriv, Kol HaKarbonos B'mashma, that implies all karbonos. And the Brisa continues, Yochel Shani Mar Ba'af Kachim Kalim. One might think I should even include Kachim Kalim, the karbonos of lesser holiness, like a carbon shlomim. Talmud Lomar Ola, the pasuk says Ola Ma Ola Kachei Kachim, just like the Ola is Kachei Kachim, Af Kol Kachei Kachim. So too we're only including Kachei Kachim, where we say that the Kohanim get the hide of the carbon. And the Brisa continues, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Rabbi Yishmael says Or Ha'ola, the pasuk says Or Ha'ola, Ein Li'ela Ha'ola. Again, I only know the Ola, Oros Kachei Kachim Minayin. From where do we know the hides of Kachei Kachim? And the Brisa says, V'dinu, it's logical, Uma Ola Shalo Zachu B'Vsaref, by a carbon Ola, where they don't merit to get the meat, Zachu Ba'ora, they do merit to get the hide, Kachei Kachim Shazachu B'Vsaran, by Kachei Kachim, where the Kohanim are Zocha in the meat, Eino Din Shazachu Ba'oran. Isn't it logical that they should merit in the hide? And the Brisa continues, Mizbeach Yochiach, but doesn't Mizbeach provide a counter argument? Shezacha bebasar, because the Mizbeach does get the basar is burned on the Mizbeach. V'lo zacha ba'or, but the hide is never burned on the Mizbeach. So therefore, just because there's a zechia in the basar doesn't necessarily mean there is a zechia in the or. Maybe you'll make that counter argument. But the Gemara, the Brisa says, Ma'alam Mizbeach shekein lo zacha b'mixas. But by the Mizbeach, there's not even a partial zechia. You never have a zechia when it comes to the or. Tomar b'kohanim shezachu b'mixas. By the Kohanim, we do find that they do get the or in general sometimes. And hoel v'zachu b'mixas, zachu b'kulei. Since they get their zoche partially, so therefore they are zoche entirely. And Rashi explains, Shazacha bebasar, again, it's a zoche in the basar be'imurim, by the sacrificial portions that are burned on the Mizbeach. And Rashi continues, Shekain lo zacha b'mixas, when it comes to the or on the Mizbeach, the or never goes on the Mizbeach. Oro shalom matzinu, or la Mizbeach. We never find or on the Mizbeach, and that's why, again, that is not a good counter argument. And we will note over here that the Shinuya Nuschos has a slightly different girsa in Rashi. Again, Rashi's girsa that we have is Zacha bebasar be'emurim. The Shinuya Nuschos has bebesar ola. By the ola, the meat actually goes in the Mizbeach. Uve'emure kachei kachim. And then there are sacrificial portions when it comes to kachei kachim. And the Brisa continues, Rebbe Yomer, Rebbe says, Kol atzmo lahutzrachnu elo lior ha'ola. Really, the pasuk only needs to teach us the or ha'ola bilvad. We only need to know that the or ha'ola goes to the Kohanim. It's obvious by Kachei Kachim that would be the case. Shebechol makom ha'or mahalech achar ha'basar, because everywhere we find that the hide just follows the meat. It has the same status as the meat of the carbon. As the Brisa continues and explains, Parim hanisrafin, Useirim hanisrafin, when it comes to bulls that are burned, and when it comes to the he-goats that are burned, those are the inner carbon chatos. So hein v'orosein nisrafin imoin, they're burned, and the oros are burned, the hides are burned together with them. And chatos v'yosham v'zivchei shal mitzibur, when it comes to the carbon chatos, the carbon osham, when it comes to communal shlomim, matana l'kohen, that's a gift to the kohen. And ratzu mafshitan osan, if they want, they can flay the hide and use the hide in that fashion. situation. And lo ratzu, if they don't want, ochlin osan al gabe oren, so then they can eat it together with the hide. And kachim kalim, when it comes to the karbonos of lesser kedusha, lebailim, there it goes to the owners. Ratzu mafshita osan, if they want, they can flay them. Ratzu ochlin osan al gav oren, and again, if they want, they can eat it together with the hide. And so therefore it's obvious in all of these situations that the hide simply follows the same status as the meat of the carbon. Aval ola nemar bava, by the ola it says in the pasuk over there, v'hifshed esa ola, it says you flay the ola, v'nita chosol insached, then you cut it up and you're burning the meat on the mizbeach. The ore is not treated the same as the rest of the carbon. So yachol lo yuha kohanim zakon ba'ora, that's why one might think that the kohanim, they don't merit to get the hide. Talmud lomer, and that's why the pasuk says or ha'ola asher hikriv, and so the pasuk is really coming to teach us specifically the ore by the carbon ola. And the Brisa continues, the pasuk says lo yiyah, and we learn from lo yiyah prat l'tvul yom u'mechusar kippurim va'onen, that when it comes to a tvul yom, a kohen who immersed that day, but he's still tummy, he's waiting for nightfall, or he's still tummy because he's mechusar kippurim, he's waiting for the atonement, waiting for the carbon to be brought, or he's in onen, he's in a period of acute mourning. In those cases, they are not going to get the ore, they are not going to get the hide. Sheyachol, because one might think lo yizku bebasar, they don't merit to have the meat, shehu la'achila, because that's eaten. But yizku ba'or she'eno la'achila, maybe they should merit to get the hide because it's not eaten. Talmud lomar lo yiyah, again the pasuk says lo yiyah, prat l'mechusar kippurim u'tvul yom va'onin, that comes to exclude a mechusar kippurim, a tvul yom, and an onin. And the Gemara continues, V'tanakam and Nami, the Tanakam of the Brisa also. Teipuk li midina, why not learn from a Kal V'chomer? Why does the Tanakam need a pasuk to teach that this halacha about the or applies to kachei kachim as well? Just learn it from a Kal V'chomer. And the Gemara says, Milsa da'asi b'Kal V'chomer, tarach v'kasav lakras. Sometimes something that's learned from a Kal V'chomer, something that could be learned from a Kal V'chomer, the pasuk bothers to write it. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yishmael, and Rabbi Yishmael, Hay Asher Hikriv my Ovidle, what does he do with Asher Hikriv? And the Gemara says to that, he uses it, Prat l'tvul yom mechusar kippurim v'onin, to exclude tvul yom mechusar kippurim and onin, that again, they don't get the ore, they don't get the hide. The Gemara says, V'tepek le'mi lo yiyah, why doesn't Rabbi Yishmael learn it from the pasuk we just quoted above, of lo yiyah? And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yishmael at time, and Rabbi Yishmael here is following his reasoning, Diyam Rabbi Yochanan misham Rabbi Yishmael, because Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, Nemar ba'ola lo yiyah, it says by the carbon ola lo yiyah, v'nemar ba'asham lo yiyah, and it says by the carbon asham lo yiyah, ma'lahalan atzmos of mutar, and just like over there the bones are mutar, afkan atzmos of mutar, and so too over here the bones are mutar. The Gemara says, Mufni, you have to say that these words, these terms are extra, so we can make the Gzeira Shaveh. Di'lo Mufni, because if they're not extra, if they're not free to make this Gzeira Shaveh, so then Ikol Mifrach, you can actually refute it. If you have a Gzeira Shaveh that's made from terms which are not free, so then if there's any way to refute it logically, you can refute it, and the refutation here would be as follows, Ma'ala Asham Shekain Besaro Mutter. Just like in Asham is unique, that the meat is mutter, therefore you can't necessarily learn from the carbon Asham to the carbon ola. Maybe by the Asham where the meat is mutter, that's why the bones are mutter. That's not necessarily true by the ola. And the Gemara says, Lo yiyah kra yiseiruhu. The words lo yiyah actually are extra, and that's why they are available to make this Gzeira Shaveh. Rashi explains, Kra Yiseiru, it's an extra pasuk, D'matzi lemechtav or ha'ola, asher hikriv lakoin v'lishtok. It could have just said or ha'ola, asher hikriv lakoin. It doesn't need to say lo yiyah. Those are extra words, and again, they are free for the purpose of this Gzeira Shaveh. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Kol ha'kachim she'ira behen psul kodem lahav sheitan. All karbonos where disqualification happens before the hide is flayed from the carbon, ein orosein lakohanim. The oros, the hides, those do not go to the kohanim in such a situation. But liachar have shaitan. But if the psul, if the disqualification was after they were flayed, so then orosein lakohanim. Then the hides do go to the kohanim. And the Mishnah continues, Amar Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim, Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim said, Miyom my lo ra'isi or sheyotze lebeis hasreifa. In all of my days, I never saw the hide go to the beis hasreifa where the disqualified carbon is burned. Amar Rabbi Akiva says, Midvarav lamadnu, from his words we learn, Shahamavshed es ha-bechor, let's say somebody flays the bechor, v'nimtza treifa, then it turns out it was a treifa, it turned out it had a mortal wound, sheyeyosu HaKohanim ba'oro, the Kohanim would be able to benefit from the hide. But the Chachamim say, Ein lo ra'inu raya. The fact that we never saw something is not proof. Ela yotzu lebeis hasreifa, rather it does go out to the beis hasreifa. Rashi explains, Eino rosein lekohanim, again, in a situation where the disqualification happens kodem lehafsheiton, the hides do not go to the kohanim, ela nisrafim im oran. The point is, rather they're going to be burned totally, again, all together at the beis hasreifa, together with the hide. Everything's going to be burned at the beis hasreifa. And then the Mishnah brought Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim that lo ra'isi or yotzi l'sreifa. I never saw that misha hofshet. Once it was flayed, it doesn't get burned in the beis hasreifa. Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim is arguing with the Tanakama. The Tanakama is saying that if there's a psul kodem lehafsheiton, and then let's say it's flayed, it is burned in the beis hasreifa. Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim says once it's flayed, we never saw such a thing. Hachi mafarsh le Gemara. That's how the Gemara explains Rabbi Chanina Skan HaKohanim v'nimtza treifa. And so then again the Mishnah said, Rabbi Akiva said, we learn from there that if it was already flayed and it turns out it was a treifa, even though the disqualification was before it was flayed, since it wasn't a recognized disqualification until after being flayed, the Kohanim can benefit from the hide. But then the Mishnah said, the Chachamim said, Ein lo ra'isi ra, you can't bring a proof from lo ra'isi that I didn't see it. Shema lo ira biyamav sheyim sa treifa achar hafshit. Maybe that just never happened during his time, that it turned out to be a treifa after it was flayed. Vim ira v'sarfu hu lo ra, and if it did happen and they burned it, he just didn't see. Eliyatza lebeis hasreifa, rather it does go out to the beis hasreifa. Hoel v'kodem hafshit have a base, since essentially that disqualification was before it was flayed. And the Gemara says, Kol shelo zocha mizbeach bevesara. This is a quote of the earlier Mishnah. Anytime the mizbeach is not zocha in the meat of the karban ola, so lo zacho hakohanim ba'ora. So then we say the kohanim, they don't merit to get the hide of the karban ola. And the Gemara says, V'af agav da'af shetei lo'or kodem zrika. The earlier Mishnah implied that even if the hide was flayed before zrika, but it doesn't make any difference. Still, since the disqualification happened before zrika, and the mizbeach was therefore not zocha in the meat, so then the kohanim are not going to get the or money. And who does that follow? Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimoni. That seems to follow the Tana Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, the Amar, who says Ein hadam meratza al ha'or b'fnei atzmo, that the blood is not meratza, does not affect acceptance on the hide when it's independent, when it's already been flayed. And Rashi explains Hachi Garsina beGemara Kol shelo zacha mizbech bevesara lo zacha hakohanim ba'ora v'yafagav da'af shetei lo'or kodem zrika. Again, it sounds like from the earlier Mishnah that it all depends when the disqualification happened. If the disqualification happened before zrika, so then that's all that matters in terms of the kohanim getting the hide. And Rashi explains va'osev hachi. This is what the Gemara is asking. Katani reish. It says in the beginning of the Mishnah, Kol shelo zacha mizbech bevesara kagon she'ira bo psol kodem zrika. Anytime the mizbeach doesn't get the meat of the carbon, meaning there was a disqualification before zrika, before the blood was thrown, meaning the meat never had a time of permission to the mizbeach. In such a case, lo zachu hakohanim ba'ora. That's when the kohanim, they don't get the hide. V'lo polig bein shehofshet kodem hapsul bein lo hofshet. In the Mishnah earlier, there is no difference in terms of if it was flayed before the disqualification or after. It doesn't matter. Al ma'afagav da'af shetei lo'or kodem zrika. We see from the earlier Mishnah that even if the hide was flayed before the zrika, v'nifsal habasar, and then the meat became disqualified, v'achar kach zarak, and then the blood was thrown, ka'amar de lo zachu ba'ora. The Mishnah is saying that they don't get the hide, even though it was already flayed. And the Gemara then said, Moni, who's the author of the earlier Mishnah, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, he da'amar, it's Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon who says, l'kamon later on, ein hadam miratzal or cholotz b'fnei atzma below basar. If the hide was flayed, so it's independent, it's not attached to the meat, the blood is not going to affect acceptance on that or. Kagon, again, for example, im nifsal habasar, if the meat became disqualified, vein hadam miratza olav, so in such a case the blood is not going to affect acceptance on the meat is not going to go on the mizbeach, so af ha'or lo yatzim midei me'ila, so to the hide, it also won't affect acceptance on that, and the hide is not going to leave the status of me'ila, lios nitter la kohanim, that it should become permitted to kohanim achar hefsheitan, after it's been flayed. And the Gemara continues and says, Ema Seifa, look at the end of the Mishnah, meaning look at our Mishnah. It says, Kol ha'kodshim she'ira behen psul, all karbonos where the disqualification happens, kodem hefsheitan, before the hide was flayed, eino rosein la kohanim, that's when the hide doesn't go to the kohanim, but la'achar hefsheitan, but if it happens after the hide has been flayed, so then orosein lekohanim, then the hide does go to the kohanim. It all seems to depend on when the hide is separated from the meat. Ason l'Rebbe, that seems to follow Rebbe. Do'amar hadam miratza al ha'or b'fnei atzmo. Rebbe says that the blood can affect acceptance on the hide, even if it's alone, even if it's already been separated. Rashi explains, orosein lekohanim, again the hides go to the kohanim. Ve'afilu ira psul zeh kodem zrika. The point is, even if the disqualification took place before zrika, but the fact that the hide was flayed, that is enough to say that it goes to the kohanim. That's what we're saying in our Mishnah, that la'achar hefsheitan orosein lekohanim. Asan l'Rebbe, that seems to follow Rebbe. De polagolad Rebbe Lazar lekamon. He argues in Rebbe Lazar later on. V'yamar hadam miratzal or cholotz b'fnei atzmo below hartzoas basar. He says that the dam, the throwing of the blood, can affect acceptance on the hide that's alone, even if it's not affecting acceptance on the meat. Again, in a situation, let's say it was before zrika, and therefore it's not affecting any acceptance on the meat, but we say apparently it does affect acceptance on the hide. And so you have a situation over here where the first Mishnah seems to be going like Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, and then our Mishnah seems to be going like Rebbe. And so the Gemara says, according to that, if again our Mishnah is going like Rebbe, and the first Mishnah is like Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, Reish Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, the first Mishnah is Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, say for Rebbe, and the end Mishnah, meaning our Mishnah, is Rebbe. Does that make sense? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Abaya, Abaya says, the Sefer Rebbe, from the fact that our Mishnah is Rebbe, Reishanami Rebbe, the earlier Mishnah is also Rebbe. And so then the question is, well, what did the earlier Mishnah mean? The earlier Mishnah seemed to say that as long as the disqualification happens before Zrika, the hide does not go to the Kohanim, even apparently if it was flayed before the Zrika. And the Gemara explains, no, Moda Rebbe admits, She'ein hefshet kodem Zrika, that they just simply don't flay the animal before Zrika. Rashi explains, Umoda Rebbe admits, She'ein hefshet kodem Zrika, they don't flay the animal before Zrika. Avagav diamar hadam miratza al or b'fnei atzmo, even though he says that the blood could affect acceptance on the hide independent, but hechad isrami de'ivshet kodem Zrika, but if it turns out that it was flayed before Zrika, modu shein kohanim regilim bekach, he admits that's not normal for the kohanim to do. She'asur lishos hadam kol kach, they're not supposed to delay the throwing of the blood that much. Hilkach nami dekatani kol shel lo zacha mizbech bevisara lo zacha kohanim ba'ora, and therefore when it says that if the mizbech doesn't get the meat, the kohanim don't get the hide, taima mishum de psul kodem Zrika, the real reason there is because the disqualification took place before Zrika, kodem hefshedu, and that really is before it's flayed. Umiya hechad de isrami de hifshed kodem Zrika. Now, nevertheless, if it turns out that they flayed the animal before Zrika, v'nifsal achar hefshed, and then there was a disqualification after it was flayed, afal pi shelo zacha mizbech bebasar, in that case, even though the mizbech is not going to get the meat, yizko ha-kohanim ba'ora, the kohanim would in fact get the hide, u'mishnaseinu dibra bahov, and our Mishnah was just talking about the normal situation. And the Gemara continues with another answer. Rava Amar Rava says, Mida Reisha Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, from the fact that the first Mishnah is Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, Seifa Nami Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon, actually our Mishnah, the end Mishnah actually is also Rebbe Elazar Rebbe Shimon. And my Kodem Hefshid, what does the Mishnah mean when it says Kodem Hefshid before it's flayed? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Dalid Amud Aleph.